Welcome back to part 2, students. So let's import our line art. Your line art will be scanned in using our scanner here in class. Now unfortunately the scanner is not large enough to accommodate the entirety of the Bristol that we drew on, so you'll scan it in pieces. You want to get the pieces so that you cover every area of the character sheet. Now before we begin, you need to make a brand new canvas. You just remember, go File, New, and make sure it's set to inches. Your resolution is set to 300, and your Bristol is 17 by 14. Now you might have different alignments. For example, you might have gone landscape, in which case the width will be 17 and the height will be 14. Or you might have gone portrait alignment, in which case the width will be 14 and the height will be 17. Do this first and then bring your line art in. Now to bring your line art in, just drag and drop the PDF into your new canvas. The PDF has 2 pages, so you'll have to do it twice to get both layers in. Now mine ended up looking something like this. I have one layer where the line art is upside down and chopped off at the bottom, and I have another layer where the line art is right side up and chopped off on the top. You need to figure out which will be easiest to stitch together. Looking at the top of his head being chopped off, that's pretty challenging. I think I could have a little more success by aligning the line art using these other pieces down here. First, we need to align our line art on one of the layers to be right side up. So select the layer that's upside down, free transform, and you'll have a bounding box show up. To rotate it, move the cursor to the outside of the bounding box until it turns into slightly curved arrows. Then, while holding Shift, that'll control the rotation so that it's in set increments. If you don't hold Shift, you'll have like 1 degree at a time, and you will have alignment issues. So holding Shift, rotate it till it's flat, hit Enter, and then let's start to stitch. Because I'm happy with the top of the sheet here, I'm going to make that my topmost layer. So I just drug that layer to the very top, place it where it needs to go in alignment, and then selecting the bottommost layer, let's try to find the areas where it's cut off. So it's cut off right where the guy's fluffy little slipper is. So I'm going to zoom in and using my cursor, align the art so that I don't see any seam in between them. And this takes a little bit of finagling. So if we look over here, we've got 2 little nubbies right here on the line art. I'm going to position that here. And you can use your arrow keys to nudge. So far we're looking good on the contours over here. Let's scroll over to the right. And I'm not seeing any other stitching errors. So again, you want to find the best part of the drawing for stitching where you'll have the minimum amount of offset. And so when you're happy, shift click and merge the 2 layers together. Now our line art is 1 layer and it's aligned the way we want. Next we need to align everything to where we want it to be. Now you may have drawn some elements very large, you may have drawn some very small, but at this early stage is where you can move things around. So using the lasso tool, if I want my figure to be larger, all I have to do is draw around him to get a selection, free transform on the layer, and I can hold down Shift and scale him up in size or shrink him. As long as that selection and bounding box are active, I can also drag the character as well. So if we want him, say, closer over to the left and a little larger, we can do that. So if I want to move, say, this detachable ponytail, free transform, shift it over. Scale up or scale down in size. Remember to hold down Shift to keep the proportions constrained. Okay, now we have to enhance and clean up our line art. We scanned this in from a traditional drawing, so the line art is very dim. Also, there's dust and scratches from the glass on the scanner and leftover pencil lines from the drawing. So first, to enhance the line art's darkness, we need to do what's called a levels adjust. You go to Image, Adjustments, Levels. Command L is the keyboard shortcut. It'll show you this little screen that is a histogram, and this shows how much black, gray, and white there is in the image. And because it's all line art, mostly white is the amount of information. What we want to do is to bring the dark slider up to the foot of the mountain range as it starts to climb up the histogram. And if we look over here to our artwork, if I back it down, this is where it was originally, and if we increase it, it gets darker. One good rule of thumb is to find any areas that are solid black on your image, like these folds, and if you can still see the strokes from the Sharpie, then it needs to get a little bit darker. Now we can overdo it, blow out the image, and really ruin the line art, so it's a fine balancing act. Once you get your line art darker, hit OK. Now we need to go clean it up. I'm going to use the eraser tool located right here, and I'm going to choose a hard-edged round eraser. And this is a very messy image. There are a lot of smudges that need to be removed. You just erase them out. So for this demo, here is as far as I'm going to go with the coloring. It looks pretty nifty, but we could always go further. The purpose of this is to teach you guys just the basics. So let's work backwards and see what exactly we have here. So here's our line art. We eventually want what are called color flats. Color flats are solid mid-tone values that are used to make selections. Inside of a selection, you can then paint without having to go outside of the lines. We use this to control a lot of stuff in our image. Then we apply shadow, then light, then bounce, and then details, splatters, and any other fun little effects that we can put into it. This process is very user-friendly. It's a little bit complex in the earliest stages because you're learning how to finagle different layers, but it results in this amazing feat right here. Let's say that your boss wants you to be able to change things on the fly without having to repaint all the light and shadow. Well, with a color flats layer, if your boss says, hey, let's make those pants a different color, you can do it without having to change the colors of the lights and shadows. It may be a little challenging up front to learn this technique, but it pays off big time production-wise. First of all, your line art layer needs to be at the very top of the layer order. Next, go up to this tab right here on your layer window, set it to multiply blending mode. What that does is it makes the line art see-through. It gets rid of all of the white pixels while keeping just the black ones, and we're going to color underneath it. We're not going to do anything more to the line art, so I'm going to lock it. That way we don't accidentally paint on top of our line. Now we want a solid silhouette here, so we're going to do a little bit of painting in gray. But before that, I don't want to go blind as I'm doing this. So change your background, paint bucket it, kind of a nice light grayish color. That'll do two things. That'll ease your eye strain, you won't get any headaches, and then also it'll help you see your midtones, your lights, and your darks a lot better. To get a silhouette like this that's crisp and clean means we're going to have to brush it in manually. So simply create a brand new layer, call it flats, and select a hard-edged brush that is not pressure sensitive. Open up your brush panel from here and back the spacing down to about 10%. Using your lasso tool, you don't want to be precise at this early stage. I'm just drawing as close to the edge of the silhouette as I can without being all uptight about perfection. If you go outside the lines, that's totally cool. We can clean that up very easily. But if you can see the marching ants, get to your paint bucket tool, which is located right underneath your eraser, and select a mid-tone gray that's darker than your background, and just drop that in there. Next, it's as easy as just zooming in, selecting that hard edge brush, and painting in right up to the edge of those contours. The reason you want a non-pressure sensitive brush is because the cursor shows you exactly where that range of painting is going to be. If you go outside the bounds, it's okay. Just shift your eraser and erase as well. So let's fast forward and just see how this process generally goes. And there we go. The figure has a silhouette flats layer blocked in. We're going to make sure we have our flats layer selected, and then we're going to go up here to lock transparent pixels. It says lock, and there's this little checkerboard. Now what that does, it does something similar to what you saw earlier with that selection. So let's say we got the color red, and we're going to paint here. It's not going to let us paint outside of the positive pixels. Negative pixels, you know, like areas that are transparent where there's no pixel information. You can see over here, this thumbnail shows all these checkers. That means there's nothing there on the layer. It's just see-through glass. You have to be on that layer for that to even work. I'm going to zoom in. use my non-pressure sensitive brush, and let's just drop that color in there. The process is exactly the same as you saw earlier, where you stay within the realm of that particular plane. When you go outside of the plane, don't worry about it. Once we add more colors, then that'll naturally start to clean the image up for you. But in general, I just recommend go around the outside first. It makes it a little bit more manageable for you. These areas over here are in shadow, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm going to have some skin tone and some beard hair over here. And then just fill it in. So just going to paint in a skin tone. Now what's going on here is I'm being very mindful of the edge of the t-shirt, right? And I don't have anything painted for the facial hair yet, so I'm not being very mindful of that. And you can see the edge of the facial hair is pretty complex. So that's going to involve a bit smaller of a brush. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm adding color and then, oh man, and I have to go back and forth, and oh no, now I gotta put the blue out, and oh geez, I got there. You could end up this as a back and forth pattern, for a long time and end up burning time. So what we're going to do is we're going to mess with selections now, okay? I'm going to use this tool here called the Magic Wand, W for Magic Wand. Remember, I'm still on my color flats layer. Transparent pixels are still locked, so it's not going to let me go outside of my big silhouette that I made. Boop. And now all of the blue pixels have been selected, okay? Which means it's only going to let me paint inside the blue area, right? I can't paint that belly that I want. So I'm going to use selections to my advantage. I'm going to tell the computer to select the opposite of that color, right? So I'm going to go up here to the word select, and I'm going to go select inverse. And now let's try to draw on the blue shirt. It won't let me. But everything outside of that blue shirt is now selected. So that's one way where we can control selections. And now I can be as messy as I want with this belly right here. And it's going to have a nice chiseled edge right up along the edge of that shirt. And so as we start to build more and more color flats and different planes of color, we're going to need to be working with selections so we don't mess up our earlier work and have to keep going back and cleaning things up, because that would take forever. That is what makes the difference between a 2-hour color flats job and a 20-hour color flats job, especially for a beginner, especially up here on the beard. You see, there's going to be some areas where the beard was a little messy, but I can clean that up pretty fast. I mean, you guys could too. Look at how quick this goes if we have those edges selected. Now over here, we got a problem because we got gray up against gray. I'm gonna have to be, a little more careful there. Maybe use a smaller brush. This gets us what we need a lot more effectively. Remember, to deselect, just hit Command D, and to clean up the edges, just grab the color that you want, paint it out. You want to get rid of the skin tone so you have an easier time filling in that jacket? Well, you can just grab the gray, okay? Let's select all of the orange reddish type mid-tone hair that this guy has. You can use your magic wand. I'm going to click on the hair, and you notice this area, I clicked here and it didn't get all the orange. Well, that's because this orange little mass is not touching this one. Magic wand only selects things that are like each other and touching each other. So to add to this selection, I'm going to hold down Shift. See, there's a little plus next to the magic wand. Boop. Now I've got all of that selected. Let's have the computer do some of the coloring work for us now. I'm going to go right up here to Image, Adjustments, and let's do Hue and Saturation. Hue means color. Saturation means how much color. I'm going to click on that, and it brings up this nice little slider window. And we're going to focus mainly right here where it says Hue. If I move the slider, it also shifts the color. All right, students, let's look at adding light and shadow. So we've built our color flats. We are not going to touch those little fellas. What we're going to do is we're going to lock them and keep them in their own layer tucked away for safekeeping. So before we paint your light, we need to work within the lines, and the flats help us. We can use our magic wand tool, which is located here underneath the lasso tool. I'm going to click on the pants, and to get all of the pants, I'm going to hold down Shift, and then I'm going to go over here and go to my new layer, and let's just pick a color that would work as a good shadow. To know what a good shadow is, sample the midtone and use what's called the half to black formula. That means if this is the true value and this is where black is, find the middle of that. That's the value that the shadow would be for that particular color. I'm going to use a ginormous fluffy airbrush and treat the leg just like a cylinder. We're going to have the light on the upper left, and I'm just going to brush in some shadow shape here. Now, there's all sorts of little details happening here with the wrinkles and the curvature of the form, and then simply carve away where that shadow would be. To make some creases, I'm going to use a hard-edged eraser and simply carve away where that crease would be at. It takes a little practice to know how that works, but in general, studying fabric, looking at your own clothes and seeing what the wrinkles do, copying that generally helps you get an understanding of dark and light. And we can change the color of the pants by going up to, let's unlock it first, go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. And we can slide the hue slider, and now all of a sudden his pants go from purple to green. But we have a problem. The shadow is still the purple color that we painted traditionally. Well, here's the second method. Is there a way that we can paint light and shadow, and that light and shadow still is the color of whatever those pants are? And then if we have to shift the color, the light and shadow changes color with it. Well, there is. If you choose kind of a mid-tone gray and you paint it on there, and your layer is sent to multiply mode, it makes the layer see-through, it makes the gray work with the colors of the layers underneath, and you've got a natural shadow value of that mid-tone color. Now your boss says, hey, let's change the color of the pants. And so you select your flats layer, you get your magic wand, you select the pants, and then you go to your hue and saturation, and let's shift it to green. Oh my gosh, the shadow color is now aligned with green. So now let's look and see, how do we paint light? It's a little bit different than shadow. I'm going to create a brand new layer. I'm going to call it light. The blending mode to paint light is not multiply, but rather it's evil twin called overlay. Overlay allows dark pixels to disappear and light pixels to stay. Rather than choosing gray, this time I'm going to use just pure white. So now let's look and see, how do we paint light? It's a little bit different than shadow. I'm going to create a brand new layer. I'm going to call it light. The blending mode to paint light is not multiply, but rather it's evil twin called overlay. Overlay allows dark pixels to disappear and light pixels to stay. Rather than choosing gray, this time I'm going to use just pure white. And let's make sure that our pants are selected, and they are. And this time, same method. Let's use the color white and drop a big light sheen on here. And oh my gosh, it just blew out all of the color. Well, here's another way that it's different. White is very powerful, so we need to make our brush very weak. If you look over here, this is called brush opacity. Opacity means how watered down your color is, or how see-through your strokes are. If I set it down to maybe 30%, then that means when I drop white, it's going to be 30% of whatever that white is, or 1/3 the strength. And already we're getting a nice light purple. Now, if I lift my stylus and drop another stroke, again, it's not pure white, but the white starts to add up on top of each other. It's a great way to get a transition. And then what we do is, same method. Let's go to our eraser. Let's get a hard-edged eraser, and let's maybe carve away some of these wrinkles. So again, light's coming from the upper left. Here's our crease. We're probably going to get a little shadow right here. So I'm just erasing that part away. Probably going to get a shadow right here. It's a little large, but you would use a smaller eraser for that. We're probably going to get a little shadow in this area. And that's one of the ways that you can draw. Add the light, carve away. Like, let's say you did some work erasing these value shapes out, making these creases, and if you were to add a darker area, you'd paint over that. That's no fun. So here's a technique you can use. I'm going to create a brand new layer. I'm going to set it to multiply. Again, make sure your flats are selected that you're going to work within. Keeps you within the lines. And let's make a smaller crease here under the knee. This time I'm going to choose a slightly darker gray. Blap it in, and then carve away. Just so we can get that crease nice and visible. Now, once you're happy with it, shift-click to highlight both of your shadow layers, merge them together by hitting Command E or going to Layer, Merge Layers, and oh no, it turned gray. Well, don't worry. Every time you merge layers together that have been on a blending mode, they always revert to normal. All you have to do is go put them back to multiply again, and you'll be just fine. Now we have all of our value. So by working in a new shadow layer, making the changes that you want, and then merging down, that gives you more control over your shadows. Same thing works with your lights. So let's look at a different form of lighting. So even though we're making a cartoon and the lighting is pretty simple, you still want to get a 1, 2, 3 read. So that would be the brights, the middles, and the darks. And I'm going to introduce you guys to a fourth one, and that's called bounced light. As the beginner, it's important to keep things very basic. Once you get into my other advanced courses, we'll go a little bit deeper where it comes with calculations. But long story short, what bounced light is this. It's an additional light source that helps the form turn. What it is, it's on the opposite side of where the light is. And yes, I know that you've learned already that the core is on the opposite side. Well, that's where the ambient bounce goes on a form. That would be any of the color that would be in the environment. Because there's no environment here, we can choose whatever color we want. And a student helped me choose the color yellow for this because it complements the color of the pants. Another thing you can do after the fact is color shift the bounce. For example, if you want a warm type of bounce light or a cool one like a blue, in general your bounce light should be dimmer than your bright light and maybe even slightly brighter than your midtone. But then let's look at how this was done here on the t-shirt, like the leftover breakfast and lunch that this guy had. I'm going to turn that off. Let's create a new layer and explore how that works. And I'm going to show you guys different types of brushes. So we've been using just the hard and soft-edged round brushes. Well, there's many brushes in Photoshop. I mean, there's a ton. Depending on your version of Photoshop, you might have a different looking interface. If you have an older version of Photoshop like what I have, you would click on the gear, and then here's all these different types of brushes that you can select, and it changes the window. If you have a newer version of Photoshop, you might only have a few brushes, but you want to try to find a gear and find legacy brushes, and that would open up all these new things, right? Because it won't look like you have them initially. Well, all I did was I just used a brush that the thumbnail over here on the left appeared like a little splatter. The stroke looks like a paintbrush, but once we grab this brush, let's see what happens when we choose a color, like say blue or something. Boop. See, it makes this different type of a texture, almost like you're using a stamp. So different brushes can be used in this way. If you were to paint with this brush, it would look like a traditional paintbrush. But if you were to stamp with it using your mouse, then you could use different sizes and opacities of this stamp to create kind of a splatter texture. And so by using different colors, doing it in its own layer, and if the effect is looking too much like it's been stamped rather than like actual splatters, then just use a soft-edged eraser, turn the opacity down, and we can start to feather out areas of it to weaken the effect. All right, students, let's talk about finalization. In our digital classes, ranging from beginner to advanced level, we always have a process at the very end of the art piece where we finalize it for submission. That involves adding presentation to our work. We always add presentation to what we're going to turn in. It's almost like putting our work on a silver platter. That presentation can range from gradients, textures, colors, fun little borders, text. But before we begin on that, the first thing you want to do to prep it for this process is to take all the layers that you've created at this point and put them in what's called a group. That makes it so it's a lot easier to manage what you're working with. To create a group, shift-click the layers of your art. Notice I'm not including the background. I'm including the figure and everything I've made. And then down here, you'll find next to the trash can, the new layer, you'll find this little folder icon. That's where you create a new group. And when I click on this, it should put all those layers into a new folder. I'm going to change my background. Rather than gray, what if we did kind of a cool bluish gray, like a cool steel gray color? We could change that. And using our paint bucket tool, just drop that on there. We could also use what's called a gradient. A gradient is a transition from one thing to another. So in a new layer, I'm going to call this gradient. And the gradient tool is located underneath your paint bucket tool. If you hold down the button, G for gradient. Now, let's look at how this tool works. If we look up here in the upper left, here is the actual gradient. You see a black to white transition. If I click directly on that, there are several pre-generated transitions here. All I want is just the black to white one. And you can change the color of the gradient by double-clicking on one of the boxes. Right, so we can have a blue to white. Again, I just want black to white. And then when it's time to drop the gradient, you just drag and drop a line, and that drops the gradient in. If you want the black to be on top, then just go the other direction. So then I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer down. And for all of your presentation elements, you want to be very subtle. You don't want them too noisy or over the top. Be gentle with this stuff, otherwise it'll clash with the artwork. So I've turned the gradient down. We've got light to dark. And I think that really helps the composition because he's got a very dark trench coat. We don't want to have a dark background next to a dark trench coat. So we've got this kind of transition from light to dark. So let's take a look at vignettes. A vignette is a grouping element. It's a shape or mass that you put behind something in order to say that these all are of the same family. It draws emphasis and cleans up the image. Otherwise, everything's just kind of floating in free space. So for example, the figure might be an element that we really want to put a vignette behind. To do that, I'm going to create a brand new layer. Using my marquee tool, let's put a square-shaped vignette behind him. Make a square. Use your paint bucket tool, and for this I'm going to use white, and drop it in there. Remember, you want to be very subtle with your presentation elements. Keep them quiet, keep them like a whisper. So I'm going to turn this down quite a bit, just so it's a very subtle emphasis. And because this is a layer just like any other, we can free transform it. So I'm going to bring some parts of the vignette into the figure to make it look as if the figure is stepping outside of those boundaries a little bit. It makes him on top of it rather than it dominating him. Also with the vignette, we can do some things to it. For example, it's because it's a shape, we could use our marquee tool, make a line, and then trim using the delete button. We could also feather this out using the eraser tool. So with a soft edged eraser at let's say like 60% opacity, erase out a portion and then lift and then do it again, but don't go as high up. Do it again until that hard edge is gone. So now we've got a vignette that gradually fades into the rest of the piece. All right, let's look at grounding shadows. A grounding shadow grounds the figure. So right now it's floating in space. It doesn't feel as if it's resting on the ground. One of the ways that we do that, let's create a brand new layer. I'm going to call it Cast Shadow. One of the beginner methods I use is to use the silhouette of the figure, make a new layer that's solid black, and then squish it down. By that I mean, let's select the entirety of the flats layer because we know it's a silhouette. To select the entirety of a layer, hold down Command and click the little thumbnail picture. Now you see we've got marching ants all around the entirety of the piece. I'm going to use my paint bucket tool and let's choose the color black. Boop. All right, doesn't look like much happened. Well, that's because it's underneath the entirety of the form. So if I turn off the group above it with all the art, you can see that we ended up paint bucketing a silhouette of this figure. So let's turn the artwork back on and make sure that that new cast shadow is currently selected. I'm going to free transform it and let's squash it down. All right, so we want it to be touching the feet. I'm going to make some subtle adjustments. And you see by stretching it down, it makes it look as if there's a shadow shape, the shape of the figure. Well, we're not done yet. It's a pretty sloppy hard edge shadow. Look, it's not even touching the toes. So I'm going to free transform, and holding down Command, it allows you to grab different corners of the box and distort the shape a little bit. I'm going to bring that shadow right up to the foot, and then hit Enter. And now let's blur it. So I'm going to go to Filter, which is right up here. Blur. There's all these different blurs. Go to Gaussian Blur. Now just turn it up until it looks like a natural shadow shape. I usually tell my students to use a soft edged eraser, and areas where it's like really close, that's where we're going to be like solid black. Areas where it starts to get far away, we'll dim it. So use a soft edged eraser with low opacity and just kind of feather out certain areas of the shadow. And it makes it feel like a natural shadow. One other thing you can do is turn the opacity down if it's too harsh. To add text, it's the letter T for text. It's also located here. You can control the size and color and font of your text. So I'm going to do some notations. Again, keep them minimalist. So we're going to keep it small. I'm going to go for about a size 8 font. And I'm going to label the different emotions over here. Just different names. It's going to be very hard to see at this zoom depth. I'm not going to use the color black, rather I'm going to use the color white because we already have a nice dim background. Zoom in. And now with the move tool we can move them, make sure they're level. You don't want them like all over the place, like one up here and one down there. Have some consistency to your layout. So for this element right here, we're going to have multiple notes that point to different things in them. So I'm going to place text at different areas around it. He's got some candy in here as well with his diabetic meds. Going to see where these line up and kind of keep them in generally the same area, right? Rather than having them scattered all over the place. And now this time I'm going to point directly to areas in it. So in a new layer, I'm going to use a hard-edged round brush. I'm going to shrink it way low. I'm going to use the color white, just the same as the text. And let's draw a straight line to the things that are labeled. Click, and then hold down the Shift button to shift click and draw a line. If you hold down Shift, you can draw straight lines this way. Click, draw a line. And then for the heck of it, let's make kind of an enlarged little dot to show where it's ending. So now I've made notes and little visual guides to point the eye. So let's take a look at good presentation in some previous artwork pieces. We're going to go from more simple and basic to gradually more complex. Here, we don't use anything other than making sure everything is aligned cleanly and in their respective groups. Also, there are some notations, and we've got a rule. Now, rule in graphic design is just another word for a line. So we have kind of this box that is a grouping element that separates this from this. And there's also a name, date, and what the thing is down in the bottom right-hand corner. Moving on up here, there's the use of rule and vignette and drop shadow. There are no notations, but notice how everything is neatly arranged. We have human figures up here, robots down here, creatures down here, with exception to this big guy. Also, note how they've been laid out. This guy is big and looking to the left and frames the image over here. This guy is larger, looking to the right, and frames, kind of locks in this side of the composition. We've also got the name, the date, and what it is down here as well. I'd recommend that you type all of this information out. Don't write it by hand like this. It'll just look sloppy. Moving up in complexity, here are some things I have not shown you in this video, though I will in class. But this is the use of texture. So like an old paper texture was dropped over here and selectively erased. Also, there is a spotlight effect that darkens and dims the corners and edges of the image so that it draws the eye more towards the center. This final one is the most complex out of all of them. It's got notations, visual notations, multiple textures, gradients, multiple colors, colored vignettes that actually start with a hard edge and then fade out into the background. Make sure your presentation is quiet. Presentation elements, the vignettes here, are very bold white squares. You want to be like a whisper with your presentation, not a shouting match. Here's an example where the character and the turnaround are not as emphasized. The first thing that we see are actually the large borders of text. They're so loud and they take up so much space. Remember, this is about the drawing, the art, not all of the notations. I encourage you all to think outside the box, but not at the expense of the art. The art here is very good, but this is such a noisy, busy piece that we're not even able to read the notations here in many of the different areas, let alone some of the artwork. So remember, present like a whisper. All right, so let's move on. Let's say we're finished with it. We've got our presentation added in. It's nice and minimal. And now it's time to turn our work in for a grade. Go to File, Save As, only this time we're going to do it a little bit different. I'm going to change the format to either JPEG or PNG. JPEG is a nice low-res file that's good for sharing. And PNG is a high-res file that still retains a lot of good quality with the image. Either works just fine. So I'm going to save JPEG, put your last name, and then make sure it's going to the desktop and hit Save. You'll be presented with this little window if it's a JPEG. This controls the quality of the JPEG image. Make sure it's all the way at max. And then here is your file, lastname.jpg. Now I do want to highlight one little area that beginners slip up on. When I say to save as JPEG, a lot of times students go and they change the file extension and think that that changes the file. It's not true. That's like putting a vegetable label on top of a steak and saying that it's vegetables. It doesn't change the steak at all. You need to change the format in order for that to happen. Now, it's the end of the day. You still want to back up your Photoshop file. So as always, follow the same saving procedures where you go File, Save As, and then add the date and keep the Photoshop file. That way you won't lose all of this and just have a flat JPEG. Well, students, I hope you found this helpful. Feel free to review and get creative. Use the techniques that you've been shown and tweak and adapt them in such a way that it still meets the objectives and does unique and interesting things. I look forward to seeing your character sheets, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Take care.